What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Thursday, November 30th edition of the NBA Lineup Generator video. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoneyDFS. We have a 9-game NBA slate tonight. Pretty nice set of games for Thursday. Sometimes we get those smaller slates, but not the case tonight. We have 9 games to talk about, find some plays from, and we're going to use the Lineup Generator, as always, to walk through the DraftKings and FanDuel slates and see what is showing up right now early on in the day. But first, make sure that you do give this video a like, whether you're watching on YouTube or Twitter. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get an alert when all of our shows go live. Now, we are going to start on DraftKings and start walking through that slate. If you're not familiar with this tool, I will go over the ins and outs of it as we go through the show. And the first option you have here is to choose an ownership setting. And what this is doing is ultimately you're going to be presented with different lineups that you can choose from to enter into your contest. And the first step here is to figure out what kinds of lineups you want. You can see all types of lineups, chalky lineups, balanced or contrarian. For your larger field tournaments, I would recommend going to contrarian. If you're playing smaller field, single entry, chalky is probably your best bet. Somewhere in the middle, balanced can work. So I'm going to go contrarian for the show. And then you have an option to lock a player into your lineup. That's not something I'm going to do on this show, and I don't generally do it as part of my process. But if you were playing one lineup and you know that you want Kyle Anderson in it, you can save yourself some time, click Kyle Anderson here, and every lineup that you're ultimately presented with will have Kyle Anderson, so you don't have to sort through ones that don't, but I'm going to skip that for this video. And then we get into the fun part where you can see your lineups. Now, the way this tool works is it's using our player projections and our ownership projections, along with our simulation models, to simulate out the slate and find lineups that we project to be profitable in the long run. Then you're presented with the end result, the lineups that grade out as profitable lineups, and you have the ability to go through them kind of like a dating app, take the ones you like, get rid of the ones you don't, and more will just keep popping up until you have as many as you needed. You can export up to 20 into your DraftKings or FanDuel files. So the first lineup we have here, you can see it uses $50,000 in salary up here at the top left. You see the projected fantasy points in the middle and the projected ownership. And then down here at the bottom are 2 sliders, which are pretty useful because on its own, a fantasy point projection and an ownership projection don't mean anything. It's all about how they compare to the alternatives. So here you can see that this lineup projects pretty well compared to the optimal lineups. And it is relatively chalky, but it isn't all the way to the left on this slider. So you do have some contrarian plays in there. And you can see right here, it's 4% Steph Curry, 6% Bam, and 3% Trey Jones. So ultimately, this looks like a pretty good lineup. You're not giving up too much in the way of projection, and you're not playing, the chalkiest lineups imaginable. So if you liked it, you could save it. If you don't, you discard it. For this video, I'm just going to save the first 20 that we get. But one other thing before I do that is one of the customization options that you do have, you're being presented with these lineups that grade out as profitable, but you still have the ability to make changes if you wish to do so. And one of the ways to do that is, let's say you looked at this lineup and you like pretty much everything about it, but you want a different guard instead of Trey Jones. You can click these arrows over here on the right-hand side. It tells you your salary up the top, so you don't have any extra salary, and Trey Jones is $4,900. So you have $4,900 to spend at this position. You scroll down, the players are listed in terms of salary, and then you get down here to where you see Nickeil Alexander-Walker's projection and ownership. Max Christie, the 2 guys that are the highest projected in that range. Caleb Martin here at $4,900 as well. So thinking within the context of this lineup, if you don't like Trey Jones, maybe you want to go to Caleb Martin because he serves the same purpose in terms of being low owned. He actually projects a little bit better, and you could just swap to Caleb Martin. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, if you're not worried about the ownership, projects a little bit better as well. But you can see here, you're adding 20% aggregate ownership to your lineup. So keep in mind sort of the purpose that guys in your lineup are serving. You don't want to necessarily just say, oh, well, I don't like Trey Jones, I like Nickeil Alexander-Walker better. And then suddenly your lineup is even more chalky than it was. But Caleb Martin's a perfect example here of, I don't like Caleb Martin. I don't really like Trey Jones, but Caleb Martin projects a little bit better. He's serving that same role as a low-owned guy. You could just swap him in if you wanted to. So that's a customization option that you have. Now I'm going to save the first 20 lineups, and on the next page, we're going to be able to see what percentage of players that we're getting to amongst the lineups that we save. That's over here on the right-hand side. We can see that we got to 80% of Naz Reid, who is in a good spot tonight against Utah. He's projected for about 38% ownership. We have him with a 32% chance of being optimal. So he looks like one of the better values on the slate. We have Troy Brown in 55% of our lineups. He's projected for 36% ownership with a 29% chance of being optimal. So 2 of the more popular value plays showing up here at the top. Then we're getting to 30% Jeremy Sohan, 30% Bam, 30% Capella. a lot of Hawks, 25% Trae Young, 25% DeAndre Hunter, and Bogdan Bogdanovic. Keldon Johnson at 25% as well in that same game. Very, very fantasy-friendly game. Not surprised to see we're getting a lot of Hawks and Spurs. Kyle Anderson is projected to be the highest owned guy on the slate. So this is an example, too, where maybe you're watching, and when I showed the slider on that first lineup, you saw that it was still pretty close to chalky, and you saw that there were some popular players in there. But one thing to keep in mind, too, when you're thinking about contrarian lineups is it's not just the ownership of the players in your lineup, it's the ownership of players not in your lineups. And Kyle Anderson right now is projected to be 70% owned on DraftKings. He's a fantastic play from a point per dollar standpoint, but any lineup that you play that does not have Kyle Anderson has already taken a big step toward being contrarian before you even put another player in it. So that's something just to keep in mind, too, when you're thinking about contrarian lineups in general. We have 20% Zach Collins here, 20% Andre Drummond as well. No real issues with any of these guys. But let's say that you didn't want 55% Troy Brown. Let's say you want 40%. All you have to do is you click his name over here on the right-hand side. It's going to highlight all of your Troy Brown lineups, and then you can scroll through and using whatever metrics you want, decide which ones you want to change. And to change them, all you have to do is you either can use the arrows like I showed you previously with Trey Jones, or you can just click the discard button on the 3 that you dislike the most. And then so now you have 17 lineups. You go back to get more lineups and then select lineups that don't have Troy Brown, discard the ones that do. And I shouldn't have picked Troy Brown because this is going to take longer than I intended because all these lineups have Troy Brown. But grab 3 lineups to replace them that don't have Troy Brown, and then you're good to go. So now we're back to our 20 lineups. We've gotten Troy Brown down to 40%. Obviously, that has the potential to impact exposures on other players. So it might take a few different tries to, you get rid of Troy Brown and then somebody else pops up you don't really want, and you kind of scale them back a bit. But that's how you can pretty easily and quickly and efficiently adjust your player exposures over here on the right-hand side. Now, to take a look at one of these lineups individually, this one looks pretty interesting. Only 118% aggregate ownership, 251 fantasy point projection. So you're not giving up too much in terms of projection, but it is a pretty contrarian lineup. We have Trae Young at the top, 19% owned. Looks like one of the best plays on the slate as far as pay-up options go in that matchup with San Antonio. Zach LaVine is questionable, but if he plays at 7,400, he looks like a pretty good play, getting 14% ownership. We have Caleb Martin at 4,900, 2% owned. Sadiq Bey, 18%. DeAndre Ayton at 7K, 2%. Pretty tough spot for DeAndre Ayton, but certainly talented enough that you don't mind him at 2%. And then we're getting Troy Brown at 36, Jalen Williams at 10, and Mitchell Robinson at 17. So again, this is an example of a lineup being pretty contrarian, even though it's not that contrarian when you look at the players in it. Sure, you have a 2% Ayton and a 2% Martin. Those are certainly very contrarian plays, but everybody else here is about 10% owned or higher. It just doesn't have Kyle Anderson, so it's already different. So that's a look at how things are shaping up on DraftKings. And now we're going to do the same thing on FanDuel. But first, if you want to use this tool for yourself, sign up using the link in the description below on YouTube or the tweet below on Twitter. It is $14.95 per week to use this tool. You can use it with updated information up until lock. So instead of entering lineups that I'm putting on the screen at 2:30 p.m., you can use the most up-to-date information. And we created this tool with lower stakes, lower volume, smaller field players in mind. One of the most difficult things, I think, in progressing through DFS as a player is making sure that you're taking advantage of the best tools that you can, but not spending so much money on those tools that you're making it impossible for yourself to profit. The ultimate goal, and I highly recommend it if it makes sense for you, is to use the more sophisticated tools like the Sims tool. But if you're somebody playing $80 a night, it doesn't make any sense for you to put out $200 a month to access the Sims tool, because no matter how good that tool is, no matter how good your lineups are, it's just going to be very, very difficult for you to expect a profit after you've put that money out. So we created the lineup generator, which is giving you the end result, the outputs from using our Sims, using our projections, but it's only $14.95 a week. It's a price point that is going to be much easier for you to overcome and still turn a profit in DFS. It will make you better. It's giving you quality lineups, and you still have those customization options that you want. I highly recommend checking it out. It's perfect for single entry, 3 max, 20 max, lower stake stuff. Great tool, highly recommend it, and it is the most cost-effective way to get access to our data and models. Now, looking at FanDuel, we're going to go with the contrarian lineups again, and we're not going to lock anybody in. We're going to save these first 20 lineups and then take a look at anything that looks different on FanDuel compared to DraftKings. And generally, there are going to be some things because you have 9 roster spots instead of 8. You have different positions, different pricing, all of that. And you can see Zach Collins here is in 60% of our lineups. He was in about 20% on DraftKings. He's currently projected for 30% ownership on FanDuel with a 27% chance of being optimal. So it looks like a really good play. Troy Brown and Mike Conley showing up with no Anthony Edwards, or a doubtful Anthony Edwards tonight for Minnesota. $5,800 Klay Thompson is a very nice price point for Golden State. Bam Adebayo at $9,700 in a really good spot against Indiana. Gordon Hayward playing without LaMelo at only $5,600 looks good. Still love Trae Young. Even more favorable price tag on FanDuel than DraftKings. Draymond Green is really cheap here and played 30-plus minutes in his return from suspension. Buddy Hield at only $5K. Looks like a good value. Brandon Miller should get a little bit of a bump without LaMelo. Capella, cheap Steph Curry. Very, very happy with all these guys that we're getting to. The only one that even is really remotely questionable in terms of talent or what to expect out of him is Troy Brown, but he's only 4K. So certainly feel better about the player exposures on FanDuel than DraftKings. And it's not really surprising because we've seen DraftKings pricing be much, much tighter this season than FanDuel in general. Now, looking at the individual lineups, kind of just scrolling through, trying to see if anything stands out in terms of being really, particularly low owned. And it looks like most of these are between about 140, 175% aggregate ownership. We can take a look at one of the more popular ones just to see, how the ownership looks there and if there's anything that in particular makes it contrarian, even though it is popular. And so up here at the top, you see we have James Harden, we have Mike Conley. They both are relatively popular because of their price tags. $7,500 for Harden, getting 25% ownership. Conley, $5,300, getting 44%. Gordon Hayward at $5,600, getting 23% ownership without LaMelo. Only 10% ownership coming into Klay, so you're somewhat different there. That looks pretty good. Troy Brown, 28% owned. LeBron, a very good contrarian play here. Anytime you can get to one of the best players in the league at 3.5% owned, that's going to look pretty good. Keldon Johnson is a really interesting play because you're going to get a lot of ownership going to the Spurs and Hawks game. Keldon Johnson's only getting about 13% of it, so relatively contrarian play. And then we're rounding things out with an 11% owned Clint Capella. So this lineup's a really good example of, if you look at the individual player ownerships, it doesn't look that contrarian. LeBron at 3.5%, sure. Clay's at 10% as the next lowest owned guy. But if you look at the ownership projections for the slate, Mike Conley's projected to be the highest owned guy on the slate. But then you have Nickeil Alexander-Walker at 43%. We don't have him. You have Zach Collins at 30%. We don't have him. Buddy Hield is 5th at 28%. Draymond is 6th at 27%. We don't have any of those guys. We don't have Karl Anthony Towns either at 27%. We do have Troy Brown, rather, sorry. Kevon Looney's at 24%. We don't have him. So we have popular guys in this lineup, but we're avoiding so many of the most popular plays that still ends up being a relatively contrarian lineup by comparison. And that, again, is just something that's important to keep in mind. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Highly recommend checking out this tool. If you are looking to do so, use the link in the description below on YouTube or the tweet below on Twitter. And good luck on your lineups tonight.